The day I found my husband of 30 years kissing his 29-year-old secretary in our company parking lot wasn't the day I decided to take him for everything he thought he owned. It was the day I realized he had no idea what was already mine. The evidence of his betrayal wasn't what shattered me. It was his arrogance in believing I would crumble without him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember that Tuesday afternoon with perfect clarity. The April sun was deceptively bright, casting long shadows across the parking lot of Harrington Global, the investment firm we had built from nothing into a $40 million enterprise. I had come to surprise Thomas with concert tickets for our upcoming anniversary, our 31st, though it would never come to pass. As I pulled into my reserved parking space, Eleanor Harrington founder, I saw them reflected in the mirrored windows of our building. Thomas's silver hair catching the light as he leaned down to kiss Natalie Reynolds, his executive assistant of 2 years. His hands circled her waist with a possessive familiarity that told me this was far from their first embrace. I didn't honk my horn. I didn't roll down my window and create the scene most wronged wives might have. At 67, with 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren, I had long ago outgrown public displays of emotion. Instead, I simply put my car in reverse and drove home to our sprawling Tudor in Lakeview Heights, the house I had personally designed and paid for when our first major client signed a 7-figure contract in 1998. My hands didn't shake until I was safely inside, car parked in the garage next to the empty space where Thomas's Mercedes should have been. "Working late again," he'd texted earlier. Another lie in a pattern I'd been willfully ignoring. I poured myself 2 fingers of the single malt scotch Thomas kept for special occasions and sat in my garden room, watching as the afternoon light painted my prize roses in shades of gold and amber. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 decades, I had been the practical one, the detail-oriented partner who made Thomas's grand visions possible. While he charmed clients with fantasies of wealth, I constructed the actual investment vehicles that delivered it. While he played golf with potential investors, I built the proprietary algorithms that gave our firm its edge. While he became the handsome, silver-haired face of Harrington Global, I quietly secured our personal fortune through strategic moves he never fully understood or bothered to question. Most people, even some of our long-term employees, assumed Thomas was the founder and mastermind. Few remembered that Harrington was my maiden name, that the initial capital came from my family, that the first office was paid for with my inheritance. Thomas had joined me 6 months after I started the company, bringing his charisma and connections but little else. I had welcomed him as a partner because I loved him, because his outgoing personality complemented my analytical mind, because back in 1992, the financial world still responded better to a man in a bespoke suit than a woman with a Harvard MBA. Through the years, I had grown comfortable with the arrangement. Thomas was the front man, the charismatic CEO clients loved to golf with, while I served as chief investment officer, making the actual decisions that grew our clients' wealth and our own. We were a team, or so I thought. The public-facing success and the private reality had always been different stories, but I had accepted that distinction as the price of our shared success. Until now. I took another sip of scotch, feeling its warmth spread through my chest as I considered my options. At 67, I was not the same woman who had married Thomas at 36. I had grown more confident, more decisive. My once auburn hair had silvered gracefully, and the lines around my eyes spoke of both laughter and determination. I had raised 3 children while building a financial empire, had guided 2 economic recessions without losing a single employee, had quietly become one of the wealthiest women in our state without ever appearing on a magazine cover or giving a television interview. I had also protected myself, a lesson learned from my mother, who had been left with nothing when my father abandoned our family when I was 12. "Never put all your eggs in a basket someone else can carry away," she had told me. It was advice I had followed meticulously. The truth was, Thomas hadn't simply betrayed our marriage. He had fundamentally misunderstood it. Our partnership had always been one of mutual convenience. His charm and my brains, his social connections and my financial acumen. But somewhere along the way, he had begun to believe his own press. He had forgotten who actually owned the majority. Shares, who held the patents on our investment algorithms, whose name was on the founding documents. I stood and walked to my home office, a space Thomas rarely entered. He preferred his corner office downtown with its impressive city views and expensive artwork. My home workspace was smaller but far more functional, with 3 monitors displaying real-time market data and a filing cabinet containing documents even our company's top executives had never seen. From the bottom drawer, I withdrew a folder, marked Contingency Plan, created 15 years earlier when I first suspected Thomas might be having an affair with a client's wife. That indiscretion had blown over, and Thomas had recommitted to our marriage with apparently genuine remorse. I had kept the folder anyway, updating it periodically with new information, new safeguards, new strategies. Not because I expected to use it, but because preparing for worst-case scenarios was what had made me a successful investor. Inside were copies of our corporate structure documents showing my 62% ownership of Harrington Global, documentation of intellectual property I had developed and registered solely in my name, and a detailed accounting of assets Thomas didn't know existed, investments, properties, and accounts I had established independently through the years. There was also a handwritten list of people I could trust implicitly. Our daughter Catherine, a corporate attorney specializing in financial regulations. Our younger son James, who had inherited my head for numbers and now ran his own tech company. My oldest friend Margaret Chen, who had been my roommate at Harvard and now served as a federal judge. And surprisingly, Thomas's younger brother Robert, who had always seen through his brother's charm to recognize who really built the Harrington fortune. Notably absent from this list was our oldest son, Michael, who had always been his father's son in both appearance and temperament. Michael worked at Harrington Global as Chief Marketing Officer, a position created largely to give him the executive title Thomas insisted our son deserved, despite my reservations about his qualifications. As I reviewed these documents, my initial shock began to crystallize into something harder and more focused. The betrayal hurt, yes. 30 years of shared history doesn't disappear in an instant. But what angered me more was the audacity, the sheer presumption. Thomas genuinely believed he held all the cards, that he could discard me for a younger model without consequence. He had no idea how vulnerable his position actually was. I poured another measure of scotch and opened my laptop. It was time to gather current intelligence before deciding my next move. The advantage of being considered. The quieter, less visible partner was that people underestimated both my awareness and my resolve. I had access to every company system, every email, every financial record. Access I had maintained precisely because no one, including Thomas, fully understood the technology infrastructure I had designed. 2 hours later, I had my answer. Email. Exchanges between Thomas and Natalie stretched back 14 months, evolving from professional to flirtatious to explicitly romantic. Calendar entries showed dozens of client meetings and business dinners that coincided with Natalie's absence from the office. Most damning were discussions about their future, a future that included his planned departure from both our marriage and the company. Once the Cooper acquisition closes next month, he had written just last week, we'll have the perfect opportunity to announce the changes. New company structure, new leadership team, new life. Eleanor will resist at first, but she'll accept a fair settlement. She's always been practical. The Cooper acquisition, our biggest deal in a decade, one I had personally structured to acquire a boutique investment firm with complementary algorithms that would enhance our proprietary trading systems. The deal I had spent 18 months negotiating while Thomas took the public credit. His plan was clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Wait until the acquisition finalized, consolidating Harrington Global's market position, then push me into a retirement that would leave him in control with his young girlfriend by his side. Perhaps with a generous but fractional financial settlement that would recognize my contributions while limiting my ongoing influence. What Thomas didn't realize, had never bothered to fully understand, was that I had structured the Cooper acquisition with contingencies he knew nothing about. Contingencies that placed control of the merged entity firmly in my hands regardless of any corporate reshuffling he might attempt. He closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching as evening settled over my carefully tended garden. The roses my grandmother had taught me to cultivate when I was just a girl glowed softly in the fading light. Living testaments to patience, care, and the understanding that sometimes you must endure thorns to create lasting beauty. Thomas had forgotten what I had not. You should never underestimate a woman who has survived multiple market crashes without a single losing year. My phone chimed with a text message. Thomas, working late again. Don't wait up. I didn't bother. Responding. Instead, I picked up my phone and made 4 calls. First, to Catherine. Sweetheart, I need your legal expertise. No, nothing's wrong exactly. Let's just say I'm updating some contingency plans and could use your perspective. Dinner tomorrow? My house, 7 p.m. Second, to James. Hello, my boy. How would you feel about coming home for a few days next week? There are some technology matters at Harrington that could use your particular talents. And yes, it's important. Third, to Margaret. Maggie, it's Ellie. Remember that conversation we had at your 65th birthday about worst-case scenarios? I think mine has arrived. Can you come for the weekend? Bring the file I gave you for safekeeping. And finally, to Robert, my brother-in-law. Robert, it's Eleanor. I think it's time for that discussion we've been avoiding about your brother's management style. Would you be free for lunch on Thursday, the place with the good bourbon and no business crowd? By the time I finished these calls, I felt the fog of shock lifting. In its place was something I hadn't fully experienced in years, the clarifying thrill of strategic challenge. Thomas had become predictable, content to rest, on laurels largely earned through my efforts. I, on the other hand, had never stopped evolving, learning, adapting. It was what made me a superior investor, and would now make me a formidable adversary. I went upstairs to our bedroom and packed a small suitcase with essentials, then moved into one of our guest rooms. Not because I couldn't bear to sleep in our marital bed, but because I wanted the psychological advantage of making the first move, of establishing that things had changed on my terms, not his. My phone rang just as I was settling into my new space. It was our oldest son, Michael. Mom? Dad just called me, said he tried to reach you, but you weren't answering. Is everything okay? I considered my response carefully. Michael had always idolized his father, sometimes to the detriment of his own judgment, but he was still my son, my firstborn. The boy, who had once followed me around my home office, asking endless questions about stock prices and interest rates before he could even tie his own shoes. Everything's fine, Michael. Your father and I are just navigating some changes. I'd love to talk more about it, but not tonight. Why don't you come for breakfast on Sunday? Just the two of us, like when you were little. There was a pause. Changes? What kind of changes? Dad sounded weird. I'm sure he did, I replied evenly. Michael, do you trust me? Of course, Mom. What kind of question is that? The kind a mother needs to ask sometimes. Come on Sunday, 9 a.m. I'll make those blueberry pancakes you love. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the guest room, feeling strangely at peace. The initial earthquake of discovery had passed, and now I was simply assessing the landscape it had revealed, planning my path forward through the altered terrain. Had built Harrington Global from a one-woman operation in a tiny office to a financial powerhouse with over 200 employees and billions under management. I had raised 3 children who, despite their differences, had grown into capable, independent adults. I had cultivated a life of purpose, achievement, and quiet satisfaction. And now, as I faced perhaps the greatest challenge of my personal life, I found myself not devastated, but determined. Thomas believed he could simply chart a new course without me, leveraging the success we had built together to finance his midlife reinvention with a woman barely older than our youngest son. What he was about to discover was that navigating away from me would be far more complicated and costly than he had imagined. Because while he had been planning his escape, I had already secured the lifeboats, the provisions, and yes, the treasure map. At 67, I was not the typical wronged wife, tearfully clinging to remnants of a broken marriage. I was Eleanor Harrington, founder and majority owner of Harrington Global Investment Strategies, holder of patents that generated millions annually, and architect of financial structures so complex that even our company's top analysts didn't fully comprehend them. I was also a mother and grandmother who had taught my family that integrity matters, that promises should be kept, that actions have consequences. Thomas would learn these lessons anew in the coming weeks. And perhaps, so would I. That night, I slept surprisingly well for a woman whose 3-decade marriage had just imploded. Perhaps because for the first time in years, I felt fully awake. I met Thomas Whitfield during the financial crisis of 1991. I was 36, recently returned to America after 5 years building investment models for an international bank in Hong Kong. The market crash had left opportunities for those with capital and vision, and I had both. An inheritance from my grandmother and algorithms I'd developed that could identify undervalued assets others had overlooked in their panic. I had rented a small office in the financial district, a humble space with second-hand furniture and a single window overlooking an alley. Harrington. Financial Strategies was 6 months old, with 3 clients and promising returns despite the economic turmoil. What I lacked wasn't expertise, but connections in a field still dominated by men's club relationships and golf course deals. Thomas walked into my office on a rainy March morning, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, carrying a briefcase that held little more than a winning smile and impressive references. He'd been laid off from Lehman Brothers, a casualty of the downsizing that would foreshadow the firm's eventual collapse, and was looking for opportunities. "I've heard you have a unique approach," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation, "and that you're generating returns that defy the current market conditions." I raised an eyebrow. "Where exactly did you hear that, Mr. Whitfield?" "Pierce Graham mentioned your name. Said his portfolio with you was up 12% when everyone else he knows is down 20%. Pierce was my second client, a former professor who had taken a chance on me based solely on my academic credentials and a paper I'd published on market inefficiencies. I hadn't authorized him to discuss our business relationship. Client confidentiality is something I take seriously," I said coolly. "Perhaps you should explain why you're really here." Thomas leaned forward, his blue eyes direct. "I'm here because I recognize talent when I see it. You clearly have the analytical skills, but you're hidden away in this back alley office where no one who matters will find you. I have connections, family wealth, old school ties, country club memberships, but no longer have the institutional backing to leverage them. I think we could help each other." His frankness caught me off guard. Most men in finance circled around their intentions, tested waters, played games. Thomas had laid his cards on the table immediately. "And what exactly would this help look like?" I asked. "A partnership. I bring in clients through my network. You work your mathematical magic on their investments. We split the profits 50-50. I nearly laughed. "Mr. Whitfield, I don't need a rainmaker who takes half the revenue for making introductions. I need clients who understand what I'm offering and trust my expertise." He smiled, undeterred. "And how many of those have you found in 6 months? 3? 4? With my connections, we could have 30 by year's end." I studied him carefully. He was handsome in that confident, privileged way of men who had never questioned their place in the world. But beneath the polished exterior, I saw something unexpected. Genuine respect for what I had built, real hunger to succeed again after his setback. 30%, I said finally. "And you handle all client relations, marketing, and business development while I focus entirely on investment strategy. 40%, and we renamed the firm to include both our names." I shook my head. "The name stays. Harrington Financial Strategies. It's already registered, and continuity matters in this business. 35%, and you get the title of CEO for client-facing purposes." He considered this for a moment, then extended his hand. "Deal. When do I start?" "You just did." That handshake began 30 years of partnership, professional and then personal. Thomas brought in clients as promised, using his natural charm and social connections to open doors that had been closed to me. I delivered consistent returns that turned those initial introductions into long-term relationships. 6 months in, we were managing $10 million by our first anniversary, $50 million. Within 5 years, over $250 million, with an office staff of 20 and growing reputation for outperforming larger firms. Our personal relationship evolved more gradually. Long hours at the office led to late dinners discussing strategy. Professional. Respect became genuine friendship. When Thomas asked me to dinner, not to talk about work for once, I accepted with only slight hesitation. When he kissed me goodnight afterward, it felt like a natural progression rather than a surprise. We married in a small ceremony 2 years after that first meeting. I was 38, old enough to know my own mind and recognize what Thomas brought to my life: social ease, connections I'd never cultivated, and a genuine belief in my financial genius that never wavered. Our first son, Michael, arrived a year later. I worked until the day before delivery and was reviewing portfolio performances in my hospital bed while nursing him. Catherine followed 18 months after that, and James 3 years later. Through it all, the firm continued to grow, with Thomas as its public face and me as its analytical brain. The division of labor extended to our home. I managed our investments, both professional and personal. Thomas managed our social calendar, our children's school connections, our place in the community. It was an arrangement that played to our strengths and allowed both aspects of our life to flourish. Few people realized I was the true founder and mathematical innovator behind our success. Thomas never explicitly claimed credit, but he never corrected the assumption either. When profiles of successful investment firms mentioned Thomas Whitfield's Harrington Global or referred to me as his brilliant wife, I let it pass. Results mattered more than recognition, or so I told myself. The truth was more complicated. In the beginning, I genuinely didn't mind the arrangement. The financial world of the early 1990s wasn't welcoming to women in leadership positions. Many of our wealthy, conservative clients felt more comfortable entrusting their millions to a man with the right background and bearing. Thomas's ability to put them at ease, to speak their language of privilege and tradition, was an asset I recognized and valued. But as decades passed and the world changed, the imbalance became more difficult to justify. By the early 2000s, other women were taking visible leadership roles at major firms. The old boys network was slowly giving way to meritocracy. Yet our dynamic remained frozen in time. Thomas as the celebrated visionary, me as the behind-the-scenes operator. There were moments when the disparity stung sharply. The time Forbes profiled 30 financial geniuses reshaping Wall Street and featured Thomas without mentioning me. the industry dinner where I was seated with the wives while Thomas received an innovation award for a risk assessment model I had created. The client who, after 20 years of exceptional returns, still addressed all questions to Thomas even when I was in the room. "It doesn't matter," Thomas would say when I occasionally voiced my frustration. "We know the truth. Our bank accounts know the truth. Why do you need strangers to validate what we've built together?" He had a point. We were extraordinarily successful by any measure. Our children attended the finest schools. We traveled the world in luxury. Our home was featured in architectural magazines. I had the freedom to pursue my passion for mathematical finance without worrying about managing people or placating clients. And Thomas was a good husband in many ways. He never missed a school play or recital, remembered every anniversary with thoughtful gifts, supported my occasional need for solitude to work through complex financial theories. He was charming with my friends, respectful to my few remaining family members, and appropriately proud of my professional accomplishments in private. Yet beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect partnership, small fissures had been forming for years. Thomas became increasingly comfortable with the public perception of his brilliance. He began to reference my investment strategy and my company in interviews. When challenged privately, he would laugh it off, claiming it was simply easier than explaining our complex partnership to reporters. The first serious crack appeared during the 2008 financial crisis. While most firms hemorrhaged value, our conservative approach and my early recognition of the housing market instability left us relatively unscathed. In fact, we grew substantially as wealthy clients fled less stable firms for our consistent performance. In the aftermath, Thomas received accolades as the steady hand of the storm, with financial publications lauding his prescient move away from mortgage-backed securities in 2006. The decision had been mine entirely, based on algorithmic anomalies I'd identified 2 years before the market collapsed. When I showed Thomas the magazine cover featuring him under that headline, he had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "I told them it was your call," he claimed. "They must have edited that out." I let it go. Results mattered more than recognition. The children grew up and moved into their own lives. Michael, who had inherited his father's charm and networking abilities but little of my analytical caution, joined the firm after a mediocre academic performance at his father's alma mater. Catherine earned a law degree and established herself at a prestigious firm specializing in financial regulations. James, the youngest and quietest, surprised us by founding a successful technology company that developed security systems for financial institutions. As the children required less attention, the emotional distance between Thomas and me grew. We operated efficiently as business partners and presented a united front at company functions and family gatherings, but the genuine connection had faded. We slept in the same bed, but rarely reached for each other. We discussed business strategy over breakfast, but seldom shared personal thoughts. I noticed Thomas spending more time at the gym, updating his wardrobe with more youthful styles, adding subtle touches of Botox and hair color to maintain his distinguished appearance. I assumed it was vanity, the natural response of a man whose primary value had always been his confident presence. When he hired Natalie Reynolds as his executive assistant 2 years ago, I thought little of it. She was qualified on paper, MBA, from a good school, previous experience at a smaller investment firm, excellent references. She was also striking with a slim athletic build, glossy dark hair, and an engaging laugh that carried through the office. At 42, I'd long ago stopped feeling threatened by attractive young women. Thomas had never given me reason to doubt his fidelity, and Natalie was efficient, organized, and deferential in our limited interactions. If she stayed late with Thomas to prepare for client meetings, that simply meant I could focus on the analytical work I preferred. If she accompanied him to industry conferences when I declined to attend, it seemed a reasonable division of labor. If their office interactions included more laughter and casual touching than strictly professional relationships typically allow, I attributed it to Thomas's naturally demonstrative personality. The signs were there, but I chose not to read them. Perhaps because acknowledging the truth would force a reckoning I wasn't prepared to face. Perhaps because, after 30 years of partnership, I had developed a willful blindness to Thomas's flaws. Or perhaps because, immersed in the massive Cooper acquisition that would crown my professional achievements, I simply didn't have emotional bandwidth for personal complications. Whatever the reason, I missed what should have been obvious. Until that April afternoon in the parking lot, when the truth literally reflected back at me from the mirrored windows of the building bearing my family name. Now, sitting in my garden room the morning after discovering the affair, I reviewed our 30 years together with new clarity. The patterns were unmistakable once I allowed myself to see them. Thomas had always valued what I could provide, initially financial expertise, later social status and family stability. But he had never truly valued me, the person beneath the benefits I offered. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it brought an unexpected clarity. Our marriage had been, at its core, a business arrangement with emotional components. And in any business arrangement, the party with the most leverage ultimately controls the outcome. Thomas believed his leverage was his public role, his relationships with clients, his position as the face of Harrington Global. What he had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was that faces can be replaced, while the foundation cannot. I sipped my morning tea, watching a pair of cardinals build their nest in the flowering dogwood outside my window. The female methodically gathered twigs and placed them precisely, creating a structure that would protect their future offspring. The male displayed his brilliant plumage, sang impressively, but contributed little to the actual construction. Yet both were necessary for success. Nature had designed this division of labor over millennia of evolution. In my case, I had chosen it, accepting the shadow role while Thomas stood in the spotlight. But I had never ceded control of what mattered most: the mathematical models that generated our wealth, the ownership structures that protected my interests, the fail-safes I had built into every aspect of our shared enterprise. My phone chimed, with a calendar alert. Catherine would arrive for dinner in 12 hours. James had booked a flight for Monday. Margaret would drive up for the weekend. Robert had confirmed our lunch. The pieces were moving into position. Thomas had texted twice, more since his working late message, each communication increasingly concerned by my silence. Good. Let him wonder. Let him worry. While he scrambled to understand my unexpected deviation from our usual pattern, I would be methodically preparing for what came next. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the Cooper acquisition documents one more time, paying particular attention to the succession and control provisions I had carefully embedded throughout the complex agreement. Then I pulled up the company's original incorporation papers, the shareholder agreements, and the intellectual property registrations that protected my algorithms. Everything was in order, exactly as I had designed it over decades of quiet preparation. Not because I had anticipated this specific betrayal, but because I had been raised to protect myself in a world where women of my generation had seen, too, many cautionary tales of dependency. My mother's voice echoed from childhood. Always have your own money, Eleanor. Always know where the important papers are kept. Always have a plan for the day the man you trust decides you're no longer necessary. Mother would have been proud. I not only knew where the important papers were, I had drafted most of them. And as for a plan, I was just getting started. Catherine arrived at 7 o'clock precisely, the punctuality she'd inherited from me evident even in personal matters. At 48, my daughter had become a formidable woman, partner at Winters & Shaw, specializing in corporate governance and shareholder disputes. Her dark hair was cut in a sleek bob that framed a face some might call severe, but I recognized as purposeful. Catherine had never been interested in softening her edges to make others comfortable. "The table's set on the terrace," I said after she'd kissed my cheek in greeting. I thought we'd enjoy the garden while we talk. She followed me through the house, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. You've moved out of the master bedroom, she observed, noticing the guest room door slightly ajar, my reading glasses on the high nightstand visible through the opening. Nothing escapes you, does it? That's what makes you such an effective attorney. It's what makes me your daughter, she countered. What's happening with you and Dad? I poured wine for both of us before answering. The evening air was fragrant with lilacs and the herb garden I'd planted when stress testing complex financial models became insufficient for quieting my mind. Your father is having an affair with his executive assistant, Natalie Reynolds. Based on emails I've accessed, it's been going on for 14 months. He plans to restructure the company after the Cooper acquisition closes next month, pushing me into retirement while maintaining control of Harrington Global himself. Catherine didn't gasp or express shock. She simply took a measured sip of her wine, her analytical mind, so like my own, processing the information before responding. And you're telling me this because? Because I've assembled a team to ensure that doesn't happen, and I'd like you to be part of it. She set down her glass. You want legal representation for the divorce. Not exactly. I don't need representation. For what I already control. I need strategic counsel to execute the most advantageous resolution with minimal collateral damage, particularly to the company itself. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. You're not planning to fight for your share of Harrington Global. You already have control secured. I smiled. My daughter had always seen clearly through surface situations to the underlying reality. 62% ownership to be precise, plus intellectual property rights to the algorithms that generate 80% of our revenue. Does Dad realize this? No. He's operated for years under the impression that our ownership is split 50-50, with him as the controlling partner due to his role as CEO. He's never bothered to read the actual shareholder agreements or verify the registration of intellectual property. Catherine shook her head, equal parts impressed and concerned. That's either brilliant long-term strategy or deeply problematic marital dynamics. Possibly both. It was insurance, I replied simply. Insurance that's now paying its premium. Over. Dinner, salmon with dill sauce, roasted spring vegetables, and the sourdough bread I'd been perfecting during pandemic lockdowns. I laid out the full situation for Catherine. The extent of Thomas's affair, his partnership with Natalie to reshape the company, the vulnerabilities in his plan, and the counter-strategy I was developing. The Cooper acquisition is the linchpin, I explained. Thomas believes it will give him leverage to restructure company leadership. What he doesn't realize is that I've built provisions into the agreement that actually consolidate control under the original founder, me, in the event of any leadership transition. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her legal mind undoubtedly identifying potential complications and contingencies. Dad will fight this. He'll claim coercion, deception, possibly even mental incompetence when you establish these protections. He can claim whatever he likes. The documentation is meticulous, witnessed, and filed with multiple authorities. I haven't hidden anything. I simply haven't highlighted it for someone who couldn't be bothered to read what he was signing. What do you need from me specifically? A review of the divorce strategy with an eye toward minimizing disruption to company operations. And perhaps more importantly, guidance on handling Michael. He'll side with your father initially. Catherine's expression softened slightly at the mention of her older brother. Michael idolizes Dad, always has. Finding out the reality will be difficult for him, which is why I need to approach this carefully. I have no desire to destroy your father. I simply want what's mine without fighting for scraps he deigns to offer. We spoke for another 2 hours, going through documents, planning contingencies, anticipating Thomas's likely responses. It was oddly satisfying working with Catherine this way, professional to professional rather than mother to daughter. I saw in her the reflection of my own strategic thinking, refined by her generation's more assertive approach to confrontation. "There's one more thing," I said as we concluded. "I'd like you to be present when I meet with your father tomorrow evening. Not as my attorney, but as a witness who understands both the legal and familial dynamics." She didn't hesitate. "I'll clear my schedule." After Catherine left, I sent Thomas a text message. "We need to talk. Dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m., at home." It was the first communication I'd initiated since discovering his betrayal. His response came quickly. "Of course. Everything okay?" "You've been quiet." I didn't reply. Let him wonder. The following morning, I met Robert Whitfield at Blackwoods, an old-fashioned steakhouse far from the financial district, where we'd be unlikely to encounter Thomas's business associates. At 71, Robert was 5 years older than Thomas but looked a decade younger, the ironic result of a heart attack in his 50s that had forced him to abandon the hard-drinking, high-stress lifestyle his younger brother still embraced. "Eleanor," he greeted me warmly, rising to embrace me. "When you called, I assumed it was about the Cooper acquisition celebration. Your message suggested something more serious." "It is," I confirmed, taking the seat across from him. "Thomas is having an affair with his assistant, Natalie. He's planning to push me out of the company after the acquisition closes." Robert didn't bother with platitudes or expressions of disbelief. Despite being brothers, he and Thomas had never been particularly close, their relationship more defined by competition than affection. "The fool," he said simply. "He's finally convinced himself of his own mythology." Precisely. Robert had been a silent partner in Harrington Global from the early days, his initial investment helping us expand beyond our first small office. Unlike his brother, he had always recognized my role as the firm's true financial genius. His 5% ownership stake had made him wealthy, and his loyalty had been to the success of the enterprise rather than to family allegiance. "What are you planning?" he asked, cutting directly to the heart of the matter. "To take what's already mine without burning down what we've built. Thomas believes he controls the company. I'd like to disabuse him of that notion with minimal disruption to our clients and employees." Robert nodded, signaling the waiter for bourbon despite the early hour. "And where do I fit in this scenario?" "You're on the board. When I execute my strategy, there will be an emergency board meeting. I need you to support my leadership transition plan rather than any counter-proposal Thomas might offer." He considered this while the waiter poured his drink. "Will your plan maintain the company's stability? Protect the shareholder value we've built?" "It will. The only substantial change will be removing Thomas from operational control and strategic decision-making. Day-to-day management will continue under the existing team, with me stepping more visibly into the leadership role I've actually held behind the scenes for 30 years. Robert took a slow sip of bourbon. "You know he'll make this personal. He'll position himself as the wronged party, claim you're having a vindictive reaction to marital problems. Let him try. I have documentation of his affair, his plans to sideline me, and most importantly, clear evidence of my majority ownership and intellectual property rights. This isn't about emotion, Robert. It's about correcting a long-standing misperception before it causes material harm." "Thomas has always underestimated you," Robert said, shaking his head. "Even when your financial models outperformed everyone else's predictions, he attributed it to luck or timing rather than genius. It's his fundamental flaw, believing his charm is more valuable than substance, a flaw that's finally caught up with him." By the time our lunch concluded, Robert had agreed not only to support my board strategy, but to reach out to the other 2 board members, longtime business associates who respected his judgment, to prepare them for the coming shift without revealing specifics. "They've always followed Thomas because he's the face they know," Robert explained. "But their true loyalty is to returns and stability. Show them you can provide both without him, and they'll adapt quickly enough." When I returned home that afternoon, I found a delivery of 24 red roses waiting on the porch. Thomas's standard apology offering whenever he sensed he'd somehow displeased me. The card read simply, "Looking forward to reconnecting tonight. Love, T." I placed the flowers in my compost bin and continued inside to prepare for my next strategic call. "Margaret." Chen answered on the first ring. "Ellie, I've been expecting your call since I received those files last year." My oldest friend had always possessed an almost uncanny intuition. We'd roomed together at Harvard, two women determined to succeed in domains dominated by men. She, in law, me in finance. Now a federal judge with a reputation for incisive reasoning and ethical clarity, Margaret had become my moral compass when complex situations blurred the boundaries between right and strategic action. "Then you won't be surprised that I need those files returned. The contingency they were designed for has arrived." Thomas finally showed his hand. In the most predictable way possible. Affair with a younger woman. Plans to restructure the company. Pushing me toward retirement while he maintains control. Margaret's laugh was short and without humor. "Men his age are tragically consistent. When are you confronting him?" "Tonight. Catherine will be present as witness and counsel." "Good. And the files? What specifically do you need?" "The trust documentation. Establishing separate ownership of my algorithmic innovations. The amended articles of incorporation from 2005 showing my majority stake, and the succession planning documents we filed with the SEC after the 2008 crisis. I have everything organized. I can bring them tomorrow morning or courier them today if you prefer." "Tomorrow is fine. I want tonight's confrontation to proceed with Thomas still operating under his misconceptions. The documentation will be more relevant during the aftermath." After we ended the call, I spent an hour finalizing preparations for the evening's confrontation. I selected my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without aggression, accessorized with my grandmother's pearl necklace, not for sentimentality, but because it represented generations of women who had built security through their own resourcefulness rather than male protection. I also prepared a folder containing select evidence, enough to establish that I knew about Thomas and Natalie without revealing the full extent of my investigation. The larger strategic documents would come later, after his initial reaction showed me which contingency plan would be most effective. At 6:30, I heard Catherine's car in the driveway. By 6:45, we had reviewed our approach one final time. At 6:58, Thomas's Mercedes pulled up, always precisely timed to create the impression of a busy man who nonetheless prioritized punctuality. I watched through the front window as he emerged. From his car carrying a bottle of champagne, Veuve Clicquot, my favorite. Another calculated gesture. Thomas never arrived empty-handed when he sensed potential conflict, always arming himself with gifts designed to place me in the position of recipient, grateful for his generosity. "Eleanor?" he called as he entered, his voice carefully modulated, to convey casual warmth. "I brought that champagne you loved in Paris last year. I thought we could—" He stopped abruptly upon seeing Catherine in the living room. "Catherine? What are you doing here?" "Mother invited me for dinner," she replied simply. His expression flickered between confusion and wariness before settling on practiced charm. "Well, that's a lovely surprise. Family dinner it is." "Not exactly," I said, stepping forward. "Catherine is here in her capacity as my legal counsel. Please sit down, Thomas. We have matters to discuss that won't be improved by your performance of normalcy." The champagne bottle lowered slowly as understanding dawned across his face. "Legal counsel? What exactly is happening here, Eleanor? I know about you and Natalie. I know about your plans following the Cooper acquisition. I know about the restructuring you've been designing that would push me into retirement while you maintain control of the company." To his credit, Thomas didn't attempt denial. The evidence in my tone was too definitive for that approach. Instead, He straightened his shoulders and shifted directly to justification, his preferred tactic when caught in uncomfortable situations. I see. And rather than discussing this privately as husband and wife, you've immediately involved attorneys and created a confrontation. That's hardly the response of someone interested in salvaging 30 years of marriage. I'm not interested in salvaging a marriage that exists only in appearance, I replied evenly. I'm interested in protecting what I've built. Thomas's expression hardened as he set the champagne bottle on the side table with deliberate care. What we've built, Eleanor. Together. Something you seem to have conveniently forgotten in your rush to judgment. What role exactly did you play in developing the algorithmic trading systems that generate 80% of our revenue? Or in structuring the Cooper acquisition that will expand our market share by 30%? Or in securing the patents that protect our competitive advantage? I made those opportunities possible, he countered, voice rising slightly. I brought in the clients, built the relationships, created the environment where your technical skills could flourish. Without me, you'd still be in that back alley office with 3 clients and a calculator. Catherine watched this exchange, silently, her legal training evident in her careful observation of every nuance, every shift in tone and posture. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps I would have found different pathways to success, ones that didn't require surrendering public recognition of my contributions for 3 decades. What matters now isn't hypothetical history, but current reality. You've betrayed our partnership, both personal and professional. I'm simply responding accordingly. Thomas's jaw tightened. He turned to Catherine. And you're supporting this ambush of your father? Based on what? Some paranoid interpretation of business plans she doesn't fully understand? I've reviewed the evidence, Dad, Catherine replied coolly. The emails between you and Natalie, the restructuring proposals, the carefully omitted details in presentations to Mother about post-acquisition leadership. This isn't paranoia. It's a documented pattern of deception. He paled slightly, the realization that his communications had been accessed clearly uncomfortable. Then, with visible effort, he regained his composure and turned back to me. All right. Clearly this situation has escalated beyond what's productive tonight. I'll move into the club for a few days while we both cool down. We can discuss settlement terms with our respective attorneys next week. I'm prepared to be more than generous. Eleanor. The house, a substantial financial package, ongoing participation in company profits. I recognize your contributions and want to ensure you're well provided for. The condescension in his tone, the assumption that he controlled the negotiation parameters, might have been infuriating if it weren't so strategically useful. His underestimation of my position was my greatest advantage. That won't be necessary. Thomas, I'm not negotiating for what's already legally mine. This meeting isn't to begin divorce proceedings, though those will certainly follow. It's to inform you that effective immediately, you are removed as CEO of Harrington Global Investment Strategies. His laugh was immediate and dismissive. You can't remove me as CEO. The board makes those decisions, and I have their full confidence. Actually, I said, sliding a document across the coffee table, as majority shareholder, I can call for your removal under Article 7, Section 3 of our corporate charter. The board will still need to vote, but given my 62% ownership stake and Robert's 5% that he's already confirmed will support me, the outcome is predetermined. Thomas snatched up the document, scanning it with growing disbelief. This is absurd. We have equal ownership. We always have. We've never had equal ownership, Thomas. I owned 100% when you joined the firm. I maintained majority. Control through every funding round and reorganization. You've simply never bothered to read the paperwork your little wife prepared. You signed the shareholder agreements. You approved the corporate filings. You just never understood what they actually contained. For perhaps the first time in our 30 years together, Thomas Whitfield was completely speechless. The carefully constructed narrative he'd built of his business genius, his leadership, his indispensable role, was crumbling before his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual confident resonance. "This won't stand, Eleanor. I'll challenge it. I'll take it to court." "You're welcome to try." Discovery would be particularly illuminating for our children, our employees, our clients. All those people who believe Thomas Whitfield is the financial wizard behind Harrington Global would learn quite a different story. He turned to Catherine, perhaps hoping to find some familial alliance. "You're participating in this betrayal of your own father? After everything I've done for you, the connections, the recommendations, the doors I've opened?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I'm supporting my client's legitimate legal position based on documented evidence and clear contractual terms. And as your daughter, I'm disappointed that you've placed all of us in this position through your own poor choices." Thomas stood abruptly, his composure finally breaking. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. You may think you've outmaneuvered me, but you've forgotten who our clients trust, who they have relationships with. They follow me, not some paperwork." "We'll see," I replied calmly. "The emergency board meeting is scheduled for 10 tomorrow morning. You're welcome to make your case then. In the meantime, I believe the club accommodations you mentioned would be appropriate. Catherine can arrange for you to collect personal items tomorrow afternoon." As Thomas stormed out, the front door slamming behind him with theatrical force, I felt an unexpected sensation, not triumph or vindication, but something quieter and more profound. The clarity that comes from finally speaking truth after years of strategic silence. Catherine placed her hand over mine. "Are you okay?" "Perfectly," I assured her. This was always going to be the hard part. Now we move to implementation. He won't go quietly, she warned. "I'm counting on it," I replied. "Men like your father don't know how to lose gracefully. They only know how to double down, which makes their next moves entirely predictable. And predictability, in both markets and men, was something I had spent a lifetime learning to leverage. The boardroom of Harrington Global had always been Thomas's domain, the place where he performed his role as visionary leader, where clients and employees alike were dazzled by his confidence and charm. Today, it would become the stage for his most unexpected defeat. I arrived 30 minutes before the emergency board meeting, giving myself time to review documentation with Margaret. Chen, who had delivered the critical files as promised. James, my youngest son, had flown in early that morning, his tech expertise already proving invaluable as he quietly secured the company's digital infrastructure against any rash actions Thomas might attempt. "System access privileges have been temporarily restricted," James confirmed as we settled into the conference room. At 39, he was the quietest of my children, with a methodical mind that saw patterns in both code and human behavior. Dad's credentials will still work, but any attempts to alter financial records or access secure servers will trigger immediate alerts. "Good," I nodded, straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. "Let's hope such precautions prove unnecessary." Catherine arrived next, immaculate in a navy suit that mirrored my own conservative styling, a visual reminder that the era of male-dominated finance was steadily giving way to more diverse leadership. She carried a thin leather portfolio containing the legal framework for the transition plan we'd finalized the previous evening. Robert Whitfield entered with the other two board members, Howard Fletcher, a semi-retired investment banker who had been one of our first clients, and Patricia Daniels, the former CFO of a Fortune 500 company who had joined our board 5 years earlier. Their expressions were guarded, betraying the unusual nature of this hastily called meeting. "Eleanor," Howard greeted me with a nod that conveyed both respect and uncertainty. Robert mentioned significant governance concerns, but was rather vague on specifics. "All will be explained when Thomas arrives," I assured him. "The evidence speaks for itself." At precisely 10:00, Thomas strode through the doorway, Natalie one step behind him, a tactical error that immediately confirmed their relationship to the observant eyes around the table. His expression darkened upon seeing me at the head of the table, in his customary chair. "I see you've decided to stage a coup rather than have a rational discussion," he said, attempting to establish a dismissive tone. "Shall we skip the theatrics and simply hear what demands you've concocted overnight?" Patricia Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps you could clarify what's happening, Thomas. This meeting was called under unusual circumstances." Before he could respond, I gestured to the seats arranged for the board members. "Why don't we all sit? Ms. Reynolds, as this is a closed board meeting about confidential matters, I'm afraid you'll need to excuse yourself." Natalie hesitated, looking to Thomas. "For direction, she stays," Thomas countered, placing a hand on her shoulder. "As my executive assistant, she has clearance for all company matters." "Not for this," Catherine interjected smoothly. "The bylaws are quite clear regarding non-board members during discussions of potential leadership misconduct." The word misconduct hung in the air, creating exactly the unsettled atmosphere I had anticipated. Howard and Patricia exchanged glances while Robert maintained studied neutrality. "Fine," Thomas conceded after a moment, turning to Natalie. "Wait in my office. This won't take long." After she departed, her perfectly tailored skirt and stiletto heels creating a staccato punctuation to the tense silence, I opened the meeting, formally. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I've called this emergency session to address a serious governance issue that threatens the stability and future of Harrington Global." I placed a folder in front of each board member. "The documents before you outline 3 critical matters requiring immediate board action." Thomas remained standing, his refusal to sit a transparent attempt to maintain the physical dominance he'd always relied upon in boardroom settings. "First," I continued, ignoring his posturing, "evidence of a plan to restructure company leadership following the Cooper acquisition without proper board approval or shareholder vote." I indicated the relevant section in their folders. "Second, documentation of majority ownership that legally invalidates any such restructuring without my explicit consent. And third, a proposed leadership transition plan that will ensure stability for our clients, employees, and shareholders going forward." Howard Fletcher opened his folder first, his decades of financial experience evident in the efficiency with which he scanned the documents. "These ownership records indicate you hold 62% of Harrington Global, Eleanor. That contradicts my understanding of the company structure." "It contradicts everyone's understanding," Thomas interjected before I could respond, "because it's a fabrication designed to support Eleanor's vindictive response to personal matters that have no place in this boardroom." I remained calm, having anticipated this exact reaction. The ownership structure is neither new nor fabricated. It has been the legal reality since our founding, documented in every SEC filing for 30 years. Thomas has simply never bothered to read the paperwork, preferring to maintain the fiction of equal partnership despite signing documents confirming otherwise. Patricia turned to Thomas. "Is this true? You've never reviewed the shareholder agreements?" His hesitation was brief but damning. The paperwork was Eleanor's domain. I focused on growing the business while she handled administrative details. Those administrative details included establishing myself as majority shareholder and sole owner of the intellectual property that generates our primary revenue streams, I noted. Hardly minor matters for a CEO to overlook. Thomas's strategy shifted visibly, his expression softening as he addressed the board members directly. "Look, I understand how this appears. Eleanor and I are going through a difficult personal time. And she's using her technical expertise to leverage company matters as a bargaining chip. This isn't about governance. It's about our marriage." Robert cleared his throat. "Actually, Thomas, I've known about Eleanor's majority stake for years. It's never been a secret to those who paid attention to the company's legal structure. The question before us isn't about ownership. It's about your plan to remove Eleanor from operational influence despite her controlling interest." Howard nodded slowly, still reviewing the documents. These emails between you and Ms. Reynolds are quite explicit about pushing Eleanor toward retirement against her wishes. He looked up, his expression troubled. That represents a clear breach of fiduciary duty given her majority ownership. Thomas's face flushed with anger. You're reading private communications obtained without authorization. Whatever Eleanor's technical ownership percentage, I've been the public face and driving force behind this company for 30 years. Our clients trust me, not an algorithm. Our clients trust results, I corrected quietly. Results generated by investment strategies I designed, models I built, and risk assessments I calculated. Your relationship with clients is valuable, Thomas, but entirely replaceable. The proprietary systems I've developed are not. Catherine opened her portfolio, extracting a single sheet of paper. For the board's consideration, my mother has prepared a leadership transition proposal that addresses these concerns while minimizing disruption to client relationships and company operations. She distributed copies to each board member, the sound of paper sliding across the polished table unnervingly loud in the tense silence. This is absurd, Thomas snapped, finally abandoning his standing position to drop heavily into a chair. You can't seriously be considering removing me as CEO based on Eleanor's manipulative interpretation of documents no one has questioned. For 30 years. Patricia studied the transition plan carefully before responding. Actually, Thomas, it appears that Eleanor is not proposing your removal from the company entirely. This plan maintains your role in client relations while transferring strategic and operational control to a newly established Office of the Chairperson, consisting of Eleanor as Chairwoman and Chief Investment Officer, with James as Chief Technology Officer and an external hire for Chief Operating Officer. Thomas laughed without humor. A ceremonial title while my wife and son actually run the company I built. How generous. The company we built, I corrected. And far more generous than your plan to push me into retirement after the Cooper acquisition. Howard looked between us, his banker's pragmatism asserting itself. Whatever the personal dynamics at play, the legal reality seems clear. Eleanor controls sufficient shares to direct this transition with or without board approval. The only question is whether we implement her proposal or face a potentially messy and public shareholder action. Thomas's expression hardened as he recognized the shifting dynamics in the room. The board members weren't rushing to his defense as he'd clearly expected, his gaze fixed on Robert, perhaps his last hope for familial loyalty. And you, Robert? Ready to betray your own brother based on paperwork you've conveniently known about for years? Robert met his gaze steadily. My responsibility is to the company and its shareholders, of which I am one. Eleanor's plan maintains the firm's stability while addressing a genuine governance concern. There's no betrayal in fulfilling my fiduciary duty. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. This isn't over. You may control the paperwork, Eleanor, but I control the relationships that keep this firm alive. Our clients won't stand for this coup. They'll follow me the moment I establish a new firm. Perhaps, I acknowledged, though your non-compete agreement might complicate that strategy. But before you make threats, you should review the final document in the folder. All eyes turned to the last page, a detailed accounting of Harrington Global's client relationships, sorted by revenue contribution and primary relationship manager. Over 60% listed my name as the primary contact, not Thomas's. While you've been the public face at social events, I've been the one actually managing our largest institutional clients for the past decade, I explained. The relationships you believe are exclusively yours are, in fact, largely mine. Thomas stared at the document, disbelief giving way to comprehension as he recognized the truth of my statement. For years, I had quietly cultivated direct relationships with our most significant clients, becoming their trusted advisor while Thomas believed they merely tolerated my presence as his wife. This is why you insisted on attending those quarterly review meetings, he said slowly. Why you volunteered to handle the technical calls with pension fund managers. Yes, I confirmed. Because unlike you, I never confused courtesy with dependency. I never assumed my position was secure without reinforcing it through tangible value. The atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted definitively. What Thomas had entered believing would be a simple matter of rallying the board against his emotional wife had transformed into a clinical dismantling of the professional mythology he'd constructed around himself. Patricia closed her folder decisively. I believe we've seen sufficient evidence to make a determination. I move to accept Eleanor's leadership transition plan, effective immediately. Seconded, Robert said promptly. Howard nodded his agreement. The documentation is clear, and the plan addresses necessary continuity concerns. I vote yes. Thomas looked around the table, the magnitude of his defeat finally registering. You can't do this. There are procedures, notifications, shareholder considerations, all addressed in the transition plan, Catherine interjected smoothly. As corporate counsel, I've reviewed every aspect for compliance with our bylaws and regulatory requirements. The board's authority to implement this change is explicitly defined in Article 4, Section 7 of our corporate charter, which you signed in 2005. He turned to me, voice low and dangerous. You've been planning this for years. All this time, pretending to be the supportive wife while methodically positioning yourself to take everything. No, Thomas, I corrected calmly. I've spent years protecting what was already mine while allowing you to believe it was yours to take. There's a difference. The meeting concluded 30 minutes later with formalized board resolutions and implementation timelines. Thomas departed without another word, back rigid with fury and humiliation. As the board members filed out, each offering congratulations tinged with the awkwardness of having witnessed a public dismantling of their longtime CEO, I remained seated, experiencing not triumph, but a curious sense of restored equilibrium. Catherine touched my shoulder gently. You did it, Mom. We did it, I corrected. This was never something I could accomplish alone. James, who had remained characteristically quiet throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. What happens when Michael finds out? He's going to side with Dad. It was the question I had been dreading since formulating my strategy. Michael, my firstborn, so like his father in temperament and perspective, would view this as betrayal rather than justice. We meet with him immediately, I decided, before Thomas can present his version of events. Catherine, can you call him? Ask him to join us in my office, not his father's, in 30 minutes. As anticipated, Michael arrived in a state of barely controlled fury, having already heard from Thomas. At 44, he had matured into his father's physical duplicate. Tall, silver-haired despite his relative youth, with the practiced charm that occasionally slipped to reveal flashes of entitlement. Would someone explain what the hell is happening? He demanded, foregoing any greeting. Dad just called saying he's been forced out of his own company in some kind of family coup. I gestured for him to sit across from me in what had until this morning been Thomas's executive suite. The office still bore his touches, the expensive art depicting sailing vessels, the photographs of Thomas with celebrities and politicians, the conspicuous absence of family pictures except one carefully staged portrait from 15 years earlier. Your father hasn't been forced out of the company, I explained calmly. His role has been redefined to better align with his actual contributions rather than his perceived authority. Michael's expression darkened. That's corporate doublespeak. He founded this company. I founded this company, I corrected, my tone gentle but firm. Your father joined 6 months after I established Harrington Financial Strategies, bringing valuable connections, but no capital and no investment expertise. He has built a successful career leveraging those connections, but he has never owned controlling interest in the firm. That's not what he says. I'm sure it isn't. I slid across the documentation we had prepared specifically for this conversation. Simplified versions of the ownership records, highlighted sections of the original partnership agreement, and a separate folder containing evidence of Thomas's affair and restructuring plans. Your father has spent 30 years believing his own mythology. These are the facts. Michael glanced at the folders without opening them. So this is about the affair. He told me you'd discovered him with Natalie and were lashing out. Catherine, standing near the window, sighed audibly. Open the files, Michael. This isn't about hurt feelings or revenge. It's about preventing Dad from pushing Mom out of the company she founded and still legally controls. A company that succeeds because of Dad's client relationships, Michael insisted. James, who had been silently observing from a corner of the office, finally spoke. If that were true, why would Dad need to secretly plan Mom's removal? Why not simply propose the restructuring openly if his contribution is so essential? This stopped Michael momentarily. For all his loyalty to Thomas, he possessed the analytical mind all my children had inherited from me. The question demanded logical consideration rather than emotional response. He reached for the second folder, opening it to reveal the emails and restructuring plans Thomas had developed with Natalie. His expression shifted subtly as he read, "Professional training momentarily overriding filial loyalty." This doesn't look good, he admitted reluctantly. But there could be context missing. There isn't, Catherine assured him. I've reviewed everything as both his daughter and a corporate attorney. Dad was planning to leverage the Cooper acquisition to sideline Mom, restructure the leadership team with himself as executive chairman, and Natalie as CEO, and effectively control the company while reducing Mom's influence to an honorary advisory role. Michael looked up at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. And you're really the majority shareholder? All this time? I am. I always have been. I kept my voice gentle, understanding the worldview that was collapsing around him. Your father is a gifted relationship builder, Michael. That talent has been valuable to our success. But he is not, and has never been, the financial or strategic genius behind Harrington Global. Then why let him believe otherwise for 30 years? It was a fair question, perhaps the most important one. I considered my answer carefully. Because partnership requires compromise. Because his confidence was often proportional to his perceived control. Because the financial world, when we founded this company, responded better to his presentation than to my expertise. And because, for many years, the arrangement worked for both of us. I paused, making sure I had his full attention, until he decided that arrangement should end on his terms, rather than mine. Michael was silent for a long moment, processing, the systematic dismantling of a narrative he'd accepted without question his entire life. I watched emotions cross his face. Disbelief, anger, confusion, the beginnings of uncomfortable recognition. What happens to my position? He finally asked, his question revealing the self-interest that had always defined his approach to family dynamics. Your role as Chief Marketing Officer remains secure, I assured him. Your skills in that domain are genuine and valuable, regardless of how you acquired the position. The implicit criticism wasn't lost on him. Michael had entered the firm directly, from business school, bypassing the entry-level positions other employees navigated, fast-tracked to executive status by Thomas's insistence rather than demonstrated merit. And if I disagree with this transition? If I stand with Dad? Catherine stepped forward. That would be your choice, Michael. But you'd be standing against legal reality, documented evidence, and 2/3 of your immediate family. He looked between us, his mother, sister, and brother, presenting a united front he had never before encountered in family matters. Throughout his life, Thomas had ensured Michael remained the favored son, the natural heir, the extension of his own professional identity. Now that structure was crumbling beneath him. I need time to think, he said finally, standing. This is a lot to process. Of course, I nodded. Take whatever time you need. But remember that business continues regardless of personal adjustments. The Cooper acquisition closes in 3 weeks, and your marketing team's rollout strategy will need to reflect our new leadership structure. As he left, shoulders slightly slumped in a posture I'd never observed in him before, James moved to stand beside me. "He'll come around," my youngest predicted. Michael's primary loyalty has always been to his own advancement. Once he accepts that your leadership secures that better than Dad's would have, he'll adapt. Perhaps, I allowed. But his relationship with his father is genuinely important to him. We shouldn't underestimate the emotional impact of today's events. Catherine checked her watch. The company-wide announcement goes out in 20 minutes. Are you ready? I looked around the office that had been Thomas's domain, the space where he had held court and built his reputation as a financial visionary. By tomorrow, it would be transformed. The sailing pictures replaced with abstract art I actually enjoyed. The pretentious military history books swapped for financial texts and economic analyses I had published anonymously over the years. The leather club chairs exchanged for more ergonomic seating that didn't prioritize masculine comfort over functional design. "I've been ready for 30 years, I said simply. I just needed the right motivation to finally claim my place. As Catherine and James left to prepare for the company announcement, I remained alone in what would become my official office after decades of working from a smaller space down the hall. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Thomas had maintained the grandest office while doing the least substantive work, while I had operated from more modest quarters while generating the firm's actual value. No longer. The power imbalance that had defined our professional partnership had been decisively corrected. Now came the more complex task, navigating the personal aftermath of a necessary but painful recalibration 3 decades in the making. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that reshaped Harrington Global, I stood at the podium of the World Financial Forum, addressing 500 of the industry's most influential leaders. My topic: Invisible Innovation, the algorithms that changed modern investment, finally attached my name publicly to the financial models I'd developed over 3 decades. Financial genius doesn't always wear the expected face, I concluded, looking out at the audience of financial professionals. Sometimes it wears no public face at all, but innovation, whether recognized or invisible, ultimately reveals itself through results. The standing ovation that followed represented something I'd never sought, but now found surprisingly satisfying: peer recognition of my intellectual contributions, rather than appreciation for being someone's supportive wife. As I descended from the stage, I noticed a familiar figure waiting at the edge of the crowd. Michael, his expression no longer hostile but not quite comfortable either. Our relationship remained the most complicated casualty of Thomas's downfall. "That was impressive, Mom," he said when I reached him. "Dad never could have delivered that level of technical insight." "No," I agreed. That wasn't his strength. But acknowledging each other's actual abilities rather than perceived ones might have saved us all considerable pain. Michael nodded, the wisdom of my observation evident even to him now. The past months had been educational for my eldest son, as clients he'd assumed were loyal to his father had remained with the firm under my leadership. The Cooper acquisition had proceeded smoothly, expanding our business by 28%. Most significantly, our quarterly returns had actually improved without Thomas's occasional impulsive decisions overriding my more methodical strategies. "Have you heard from him?" I asked as we walked toward the reception area. "He's in Palm Beach, looking at commercial real estate for his new venture." Michael hesitated. He asked if I'd considered joining him once my non-compete expires next year. "And will you?" "I haven't decided. His business plan has—" He searched for a diplomatic phrase. "Optimistic projections." I smiled slightly at the understatement. Thomas's new investment boutique had struggled to attract clients without the algorithmic advantages and institutional reputation of Harrington Global. Natalie remained by his side, though I suspected her enthusiasm had dampened as the promised lifestyle of luxury had given way to the hard realities of startup business development. The divorce had finalized 3 months earlier, surprisingly, straightforward once Thomas accepted the documentation of my separate property and business ownership. He had walked away with his personal assets, a generous cash settlement, and his freedom, which seemed increasingly pyrrhic as the true nature of our respective contributions became evident in our separated endeavors. "Whatever you decide," I told Michael, "your position at Harrington remains secure as long as your performance warrants it." He understood the subtle shift in our relationship. I was no longer the mother who would unconditionally support his career regardless of merit. I was the chairwoman who evaluated all executives by the same standards. The entitled son had been replaced by the accountable professional. At 70, I had discovered an unexpected pleasure in visibility. After decades of operating behind Thomas's more flamboyant presence, I found my direct leadership style resonated with clients seeking substance over showmanship in the post-2008 financial world. My occasional media appearances highlighted technical expertise rather than personality, focusing on investment philosophy rather than lifestyle profiles. Catherine joined us at the reception, her legal practice now including regular counsel for Harrington Global alongside her external clients. At her suggestion, we had established the Eleanor Harrington Fellowship for Women in Financial Mathematics, funding advanced education for promising female analysts who might otherwise remain in supporting roles. "The London office called," she informed me. "The regulatory approval came through. We can announce the European expansion next week." I nodded, satisfaction warming me more than the champagne in my hand. The expansion represented the culmination of years of careful planning. Work I had begun long before Thomas's betrayal had forced my emergence from the shadows. James approached with his husband Eric, both dressed in the understated elegance that characterized their personal style. As Chief Technology Officer, James had transformed our digital infrastructure, creating security and efficiency innovations that were becoming industry standards. His quiet competence had earned respect throughout the organization, including from employees who had initially questioned the wisdom of family leadership. "Congratulations on the speech, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "The technical explanation of your counter-cyclical modeling was brilliant without being intimidating." High praise from my most technical critic, I smiled. "Are we still meeting?" "Tomorrow about the new retail investment platform?" He nodded. "All the development benchmarks look promising. We could revolutionize how ordinary investors access institutional quality analytics." This was the unexpected gift of my delayed emergence, the opportunity to collaborate directly with my children as respected professionals rather than through the filter of their father's ego. Our family relationships had evolved into something more honest, more balanced, and ultimately more rewarding than the performative harmony we had maintained during my years in Thomas's shadow. That evening in my hotel suite, overlooking the glittering financial district where I had built my career, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal that had catalyzed my transformation from supporting player to acknowledged leader had been painful, but necessary. Like the pressure that transforms carbon to diamond, it had revealed strengths I might otherwise have kept concealed even from myself. Thomas had left me for his secretary, believing he controlled the empire we had built. I had emerged with what had always been mine: the company, the expertise, the respect of those who truly understood value. But more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. At 70, I had finally stepped fully into the light of my own creation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.